Welcome to part two of this full stack tutorial where I will be showing you how to build this Spotify VR player that you can connect your Spotify account to and play music in WebVR. I also have links in the description, one with the started code so you can follow along with these tutorials and the other with the finished code. And in this video we'll be diving into how to build the backend for this project. We're going to start off by creating our backend first. So what you'll want to do is create another folder called server. And inside of here, we can add an index.js file. We're going to want to install a few more dependencies that we'll need. These are going to be some dev dependencies, and these will be used to both create and run our server. So the dependencies that we're going to need to install are Express.env, npm run all, and request. And we'll want to save these as dev dependencies, and we'll just run that. And yeah, installed it. We'll check our package.json, and yeah, you should see those dependencies that we just installed under dev dependencies. So before we start adding any code to our project, one of the main things we need to do uh, is to create an app inside of our Spotify developer account. To create one, you want to go to developer.spotify.com/dashboard, and you'll want to log in using your Spotify credentials. Once you get to your dashboard, what we're going to want to do is create a new app, and you can give it a name like Spotify VR, give it a description, and you'll need to check this checkbox and then just hit create. I already created mine, so this is what it'll look like. It should show a green. If we click on it, this is what you should see. This is your application, and it gives you a good bit of data to look at. But the main thing we're going to need for now is a client ID that will automatically be generated when you create a new app. And we'll need this client secret. Next thing we'll want to do is we'll want to add a .env file. So once we've created our .env file, we're going to want to add two keys. The first will be our Spotify client ID, and the second will be the Spotify client secret. You'll just want to copy and paste them from the app you created. So once you've added that to your .env file, we can start building our backend. First thing I'll do is I'll create a couple objects using some of the dependencies that we installed. After I add those constants, I'll add another one called port, which will look for a port environment variable to run the server on, and if it's unable to find one, it'll just run on port 8080. Now, in order to be able to look for environment variables with process.env, we first need to add .env.config, and now should be good. Next, I'll add a access token property in the global scope, and this is how we'll store the access token we retrieved from the Spotify API. Next, I created a client ID and client secret variables that should grab the values we added in our .env file. We'll create a new Express object called app, and with this, we'll be able to create routes for our backend. The first route will be a get method called auth login, and this will redirect users to the Spotify login and ask them for permission to use their Spotify account in this app. The next one is going to be auth callback, and here's where we'll actually make a API call to get the token and then store it so that we can use some of the functionalities of Spotify. Now we want to set our app to listen in our constant port, and once it starts listening here, we'll print out listening at localhost and then the port number. And yeah, this is the basic setup for our backend Express server. So To run this, we can go into our package.json, and inside of our scripts, we can add a script called server, and we can just say node server. We can try running npm run server, and you'll see that we are listening in port 8080. So this code is running, and yeah, our backend so far seems to be working. Now we'll add a function that generates a random string, which we'll use in the auth login route as a parameter for something called a state. What a state does is it helps protect against cross-site forgery attacks. Though it's not mandatory, it's recommended, and since the code for the random string generator was already there, I went ahead and added it. So this function takes in a parameter called length. This is what we use to set the length of the random string. We then create a variable called text and a variable called possible that has all of our characters that we can choose. Based on the length of the random string, we loop through and select the random character from possible and append it to the text variable. And then once we're done looping, we just simply return text. After this, we can head on over to the auth login route. As I mentioned before, here we're going to be redirecting the user to a Spotify login screen and allow them to grant us permission. First thing we're going to add is something called a scope. And what this is, it's basically the information that we want to access from the user. Then we'll add our state, which as I mentioned is what we're using the generate random string function. We'll set the length to 16, and then we'll create this auth query parameter, which will be a new URL search param. And then inside to create it, we'll add a response type, be code. We'll pass in our Spotify client ID. We'll pass in the scope. This redirect URI is gonna be the next route that we hit, the auth callback, and then we'll pass in our state. And then finally, the last thing is this res.redirect. This is what's going to be doing the redirecting to the Spotify login page. So we'll say res.redirect https account.spotify.com/authorize, and then at the end we'll append this auth query parameter as a string. So now before we continue, we're going to go back to our Spotify dashboard and click on edit settings, and then we're going to scroll down to where it says redirect URIs. As you can see, we have the localhost 3000 auth callback route here, and you don't have it yet, but what you need to do is add it to these redirect URIs, and you can just add it on here and click on add. And basically what these are whitelisted addresses to redirect after the authorization is either successful or if it fails. And if we try to redirect back to a random link, it will not work. It'll only work for these redirect URIs. So once we have that, we can come back and start working on our auth callback route. We'll create a variable called code that's grabbing the code value from the request. Then we're going to create a object called auth options, which is pretty much where we're going to put all our headers and URL for this post call. Our URL is going to be accounts.spotify.com/API/token. We're going to have a form which passes our code, a redirect URI, which will be this route again. So HTTP localhost 3000 auth callback. And then a grant type will be authorization code. For our headers, we'll have an authorization header, which will say basic, and then we'll use this buffer from to convert our Spotify client ID and Spotify client secret into a basic 64 string. Then the next header will be a content type, which will be just an application form URL encoded. And then we'll set JSON equal to true. For our request, it's going to be a post. We'll pass in our auth options. Then we'll need the error response and then the body from this request. If there's not an error and our response status code is 200, then we'll set our access token to whatever's being sent from this what's from the response in the body, and then we'll redirect to our root. Now we'll be adding a auth token route to return the access token to in the front end. This access token will be used to instantiate the web playback SDK and then eventually perform API calls. And to do this, we'll just be returning a JSON object that has the access token value in it. Next thing we're going to work on is our proxying backend request. So during the development phase, our React app and backend will run on different hosts and ports. The client runs on localhost 3000, and then our backend will run on localhost 8080. Thus, we need to tell the React app where to find the server when doing API calls such as auth login or auth token. So there's different approaches to do so. We'll be using the HTTP proxy middleware package to set up our proxy. And to start, we'll start by installing this package, running npm install HTTP proxy middleware, and we'll save it as a dev dependency. Now we'll need to add a new file called setup proxy to our source folder. So this is how we'll be setting up a proxy. Um, we'll need to use a function from the dependency we just installed called create proxy middleware. Then we'll add our module.export. Then in here, app.use, and it'll proxy any route that has auth in it. And here's where we'll create our proxy middleware by passing in an object with a target property and setting this target property to localhost 8080. So once we've done this, I'm gonna go back to our login route. I messed up and forgot to put accounts and just put account. So if you're following along and do the same thing, you can just go back and add the S. Now I'm gonna go into the app file. We're going to remove this callback function. We won't be needing it in login anymore. And we can go ahead and remove this update token, and we'll replace it with our use effect hook. And this should run once the component is mounted. And in here, we're going to add an async function called get token. And what this is going to do, it's going to create a response using fetch. And we're going to hit our auth token endpoint in our server in our backend. We'll wait for the response and we'll grab the JSON from there. Then we're gonna grab access token and set our value token by using the set token function. And then we're gonna actually run the function get token. Now we're gonna come into login. We can remove this props and then props callback token, and instead we're gonna say window.location.href, and we're gonna put auth login. So once we click on the button to log into Spotify, it'll try to hit this endpoint, our auth login endpoint. Now, to run everything, we're going to add another script called dev, and inside of here, we're going to say run -p and then run server and start. So this will run our backend and our front end at the same time. And now we can just say npm run dev. And this should get our project running. It'll be our front end is going to run on localhost 3000 and our back end on localhost 880. So once we click on the login button, you should be redirected to the Spotify login, and you can go ahead and log in with your credentials. Once you're logged in, you should be able to be rerouted back into the metaverse. And that'll pretty much do it for our backend.